Kia ora, tēnā koutou katoa. Ko Rachel Smith tōku ingoa no Ōtautahi Ahau. Welcome everyone. My name is Rachel Smith and I'm coming to you from Ōtautahi, Christchurch, Aotearoa, New Zealand. And I'm very excited for this first panel in our Festival of Flash for 2025, where we're going to be talking climate and creativity with a bunch of wonderful writers. And apologies for our late start to anyone who was attempting to watch us live too. So we will be beginning our hour from now. So I thought I would start with a quick round of introductions so we all kind of know who each other is, and then we'll go from there. I have a few questions and feel free to ask each other questions as well. So firstly myself, I'm Rachel. I'm a writer, mainly of very short fiction and poetry a little bit as well. I'm an editor at Flash Frontier magazine, and I'm also involved in climate activism. So as I introduce you, if you could give a wave, that would be great so we know who each other are. So starting with you, Eric. There's Eric. So Eric is the author of 3 books of poems. His most recent book of poems, Sick Power Trip, is coming out very soon, later next month. Oh, there it is. Thank you, Eric. And he co-edited No Other Place to Stand, an anthology of climate change poetry from Aotearoa in the Pacific. Originally from New Jersey, Eric lives in Ōtautahi, Christchurch. Welcome, Eric. And next we have Nina Schuyler, who is coming to us from San Francisco in the US. So Nina's story collection, In This Ravishing World, won the W.S. Porter Prize and the Prism Prize for Climate Literature. Her novel Afterword won the Forward Indies Book of the Year Award for Science Fiction and Literary. So welcome. We're looking forward to hearing more about your new book. Michelle Alve is joining us today too. Michelle is a writer and an editor. Most recently, her collection of a collection of 100 stories in English and Te Reo Māori called Poto Short, which was launched in Ōtautahi last night, and Eric and I both read it that. So yeah, Michelle and Kiripia Hana Wong are the editors of the anthology. So welcome, Michelle. And Robert is coming to us from, actually, I don't know where you're coming from. You're in Aotearoa, but you're not, are you in Massey, based in Massey at the moment?
Yes, so I live in the South Island, hence the mountains behind me.
Beautiful. So Robert Sullivan, Ngā Puhi Kai Tahu in Irish, wrote Hoporangi Songcatcher, Poems from the Maramataka, which was shortlisted for the Mary and Peter Biggs Award for Poetry at the 2025 Ockham New Zealand Book Awards. Congratulations on that. He's the author of 9 books of poetry, a graphic novel, and an award-winning book of Māori legends for children, as well as co-editing several anthologies of Polynesian and Māori poetry, and an associate professor of creative writing at Massey University. You sound very busy, Robert. Thank you for joining us today. And lastly, sorry, just pulling up on here, we have Linda Collins, who is a memoirist, poet, fiction writer, journalist, and editor. She is also a mental health care advocate and co-founder of the Please Stay movement for youth suicide prevention in Singapore. So welcome, Linda. So thanks all so much for joining us today. So I have a question to get us started. Oh, Susan, are you here? Sorry. Oh, kia ora, Susan.
Dora, so sorry to be flying in late. Happy to join you.
No, it's wonderful to have you here. So Susan is a writer, poet and academic from Otepoti, Dunedin, where she lives in a woodland garden overlooking the harbour, which sounds just amazing. And she is trained in social anthropology and communication studies. She is currently a senior lecturer at the University of Otago, and among her awards are winner of the Storylines Notable Book Awards for your beautiful picture book, The Lighthouse Princess, in 2022, and winner of National Flash Fiction Day in 2022 as well. Great. So I have a question to get us all started. Feel free to ask each other questions as we go, and we'll see how our conversation, where it takes us. So first off, I'm going in the deep end. Creativity is often impacted by the events of our time. So in this time of the climate crisis, both what is happening now and what is to come, how does climate impact your writing? Sorry, I know that's a big question as a starter, isn't it? Would anyone like to jump in, or else I will ask someone?
I'll just start just to get things starting and
Lovely.
going. Well, I can't look away at this point. I know there's some writers that can. I cannot look away from the climate crisis, the climate emergency. So I am, in this ravishing world is all about the present day climate situation and characters responding to it. I guess I feel I have an obligation or even a duty to address and include that what some people call the other than human world or the more than human world, which has given me so much. And feel like what I can do compared to anything else is write stories. So that's what I did, and then my current work now is all engaged with that as well. And what I read tends to be in that area as well.
Thank you, Dana.
Good, Nina. Thanks for sharing. For me, so I'm primarily a poet and an Indigenous poet. Being tangata whenua is just part of my poetics. That term tangata whenua means people of the land. But of course, the people part isn't necessarily the most important part, because within a Māori worldview, whakapapa includes the non-human, that we are descended from the Sky Father, the Earth Mother, and all the creatures in between. So we're tightly interwoven. And so in cultural terms, one of the most important motifs is the spiral, which we use in whakaaro, which references the cosmos, but also activity. And it's not just human activity. So you see the spiral most commonly in our meeting houses. And so we're always present with our ancestors who are also non-human. And so to live in the world means to live in the whole world and not just the human bit. So kia ora.
Kia ora.
I'll jump in now because I'm glad that Robert mentioned non-human life. Because to me, definitely, like we can get very focused on the stats of climate change whilst forgetting biodiversity loss is actually probably the single most important consequence of climate change. And that's something that just on an emotional level makes me heartsick. In terms of how does climate impact my writing? I think the thing about it is that it's I know it's going to be there for the rest of my career and long beyond that. And it's so big, so therefore to me it's love, death, and climate change are the kind of three, or maybe throw in capitalism because I don't have any optimism that that's getting destroyed soon either. But when you have something that big, of course you're not going to be able to ignore it, but it's also because it's so massive, I don't necessarily feel at any given moment like I have to address it because I know I'm going to come back to it. I always have. And there's something freeing about that sense that I know I'm never going to have the final word to say on it. Loads of other people are going to come up with things that address it from the angles they need to address it from. And when you have something that big and you know you're going to return to it, it also makes you feel I don't know, you're actually contributing something. I guess partly what we all, I assume, want to do as writers is not just write for ourselves, but for others. And I feel when you have a subject that big and you feel you might be making a contribution, that you're actually doing something valuable. Got it.
Yeah, and I think that actually what all of you have said so far, it really makes me think about how we're all situated in the world, that something like climate change, precisely what Eric says, it's so big, it's hard to go in and just tackle one issue. It's sort of always looming and always present, and it is, the thing of our age. But it very much is something that, like Eric, I think, well, we're not going, it's going to go on, maybe on us in this generation. It's something for our children and our grandchildren and etc. And so I think a big issue like this, the big issue of our times, is something that transcends a sort of a temporal, a timeline, and also it's global. It's not a geographic thing. Sometimes we write about our identities quite locally, or we pay attention to something, regionally because it's within our grasp. And I think the climate crisis is something that's so big that it causes us to look outside of ourselves even more. And I think that's really wonderful. But I did just the other day, somebody was saying, we were having this conversation about how it's so big it can be overwhelming. But as a creative, the way we do tend to turn almost locally to something that we can focus on and that's where we push our activism. So in a lot of ways, I think a lot of creative people that I know, whether not just writers or poets who are in the room, but people in music and visual arts, they're all activists because it's about something that's across time and geographies. And I think that's, and of course, it's not a human problem. It's the world. It's the whole world. And so, yeah, somehow that relates. And I feel like I'm sort of stuck somewhere in that space as well. And, it's the only space we can be, I think, as creative people.
I just want to point out that even though it's global, climate change affects different areas differently. So there's millions of stories. Because you're situated in New Zealand, I believe right now, you have that kind of dynamic going on. It's what you live with. But, Bay Area, we have wildfires and the flooding. And so it's a different story here. And it's going to be different in New York City, which is, at sea level. And as the sea rises, not when, but when, they will have that story. So all these different areas have all these different stories to tell, which I think is fabulous in a way. Like we have all the voices speak out because it's going to be a community of voices. There's not going to be a single hero that comes and saves everybody.
And that's so right. And like I come from 2 tribes, and we're actually forest people, but most of our forests are gone. We're known for being a country of paddocks, of sheep and cows, but where are our great trees, and they're our ancestors, our relatives, and the whole communities around each of those trees, they're gone. They're just little clumps left, across our country.
And that's your story. I don't have that story. It's like,
yeah.
So that's why I think that this will never be overdone. It could never be overdone, because I would love to read about that affinity or that relationship to people and to the tree, that we are forest people. That's so, another way to view the world even.
I really resonate with what you're all saying about the bigness of it. And also how that's somehow also anchored in very specific places and time and moments and community and bodies almost. Timothy Morton talks about climate change as a hyper object, like it's just too big to actually be knowable or tangible, at least, as a whole. For me, my writing is, I'm not really driven by when I know something already or I understand it or I know what I want to say. It's more when I have something I can't quite grasp or don't yet understand that I'm driven to kind of write into it. So again, climate change is that for me, that bigness and diversity and complexity draws me into want to write so that I and perhaps, us together can understand a little more by feeling into it.
Yeah, thanks for that point. I have to confess that for a long time in my writing, I shied away from writing about climate change or nature, in fact, because I thought that's for the scientists or that needs a sort of specialized take. I mean, there's been wonderful books by people who know about these subjects and write in a creative way. So then I thought, but I really have things to say. So why not work with the experts, find allies? So I found a scientist at our National Science Centre in Wellington, Stuart Henrys, and so I went without a car for about 25 years. So I did a story where Stuart calculated how much carbon dioxide emissions I'd saved in that process. Even, it's quite a complex calculation because I had to include, at the time I had rental cars and stuff. And then that got published in Asia. And I lost my fear of writing without that underpinning from the science world. And now I'm currently doing a month-long course with Claire Shaw in the UK, wonderful northern poet. Every night we write about aspects to do with wild writing. And so I've realized I can write about my immediate environment and dive deep, like bugs in the soil. I've got really excited about that now.
Right.
And just having other people give me a way in has helped. Yeah.
Oh, thank you so much, Linda. So many wonderful threads in here. It's hard to know which direction to go in. I guess I really like how we're talking about how climate crisis is such a big thing, and yet it's also so small and personal, and that in any way that we talk about the natural world, it is climate crisis is a part of that conversation. So I guess when you're approaching a piece of writing, are you thinking, I'm thinking for your collection, Nina, and I guess Robert, for your poetry as well, is it something that just comes in inherently without you thinking about it when you're writing about like the space that you're living in or being in? Or are you thinking of a particular scenario in a particular story that you want to tell, like maybe I'm thinking of a Pacific island where the sea level rise is impacting life now, although you may not be telling that particular story. So are you thinking of like an actual state that's happening, or does it just kind of weave into your work naturally?
Well, in my short story collection, which is a little bit novelesque, I intentionally set out to write about the climate crisis. So I structured it as that was the kind of the centerpiece, and then 9 points of view, including the voice of nature. So 9 different characters, including nature's voice, came in. And I did that because I was in shelter in place during the pandemic. In California, we had that. And I was looking at how the global response to the pandemic was not a unified front. And it made me very concerned of what was going to happen with the climate crisis. If we can't, as a world, as the earth, come together and make some decisions, what's going to happen with, the next global crisis, which is the climate crisis. And that said, I intentionally said I need to do something because I was falling into despair. I was being annihilated by despair. It's like I have to write something. And my scientific friends, I have quite a few, Linda, that I work with. And I said, what should I do? And they said, well, you know how to write, go write something. But for that book, I did work with a lot of scientists. I have a whole chapter on deep time. I asked one scientist, like, what's the most awesome thing you've ever learned about science? She's a biologist. It's like deep time, like the evolution of the earth from 4.5 billion years ago. And look at where we are, but all this amazing life in the ocean and also land. So I have a chapter, and she went through all the science to make sure it worked. I have another section how human activity has affected the earth. Like we're actually tilted a different way at this point, the earth is, if you can believe it, because of human activity. And again, I worked with my scientist friends to make sure those facts were correct, because I didn't want to misrepresent anything at the science level that if people read it, it's like, my God, human activity has dramatically changed the planet. I mean, if you are alive from 1950 on, you have, radioactive material in your teeth because of nuclear testing. It's like, I do, these things that we've done to the earth. So it was a very intentional act. And like most of you, it's now part of life, death, and climate crisis. Like it's part of the triad at this point. So the thing for me, the challenge is not to be pedantic or didactic, not to be preachy. And I think, and I'd love to hear what everyone thinks about this, but so that I really get into character and the struggles, the internal struggles they have. This is not an easy problem, right? So I have one character, for example, do I have a baby or not? Do I bring life into this world or not even, So trying to get the conflict and the dilemmas, and why is this so difficult at the character level?
That's so inspirational, Nina. Thanks so much. I really look forward to reading your work and teaching your work, because I can hear it. I can just hear the commitment in your voice and the engagement on so many different levels. So thank you. I love that concept of deep time, because it does speak to whakapapa as well, which is a genealogical conception of time. As Indigenous folks, we always got the past before us. And the past, unfortunately, includes colonisation. And so how do we include discourses around colonisation in this climate crisis that we're in? And it's no accident that the pockets of well-being in our world tend to be associated with Indigenous people. If you look in our country, our homelands are where the forests remain. And there are coastal sites, even in Dunedin, that are associated with our tribe of Kaitahu. They're only well because of our people. And I'm talking about Indigenous tangata whenua. So colonisation is an unhappy accident that has really contributed to the climate crisis. If only people would wake up and see that sovereign justice has so many aspects to it. So when I wrote my book, Hopurangi, I relied on, I guess some other people would say it's a moon journal, but I was relying on the energy of the lunar cycle. So each day within our traditional Māori calendar has a different name, and it's associated with a different energy phase of the moon. And being a poet, I love weaving different kinds of poetics. So William Blake is a poet whose work I deeply admire and love because of his sense of social justice. But he said energy is eternal delight. And so the energy from the moon informs the collection. That's what provided the structure for hopurangi or songcatcher. And I think of sovereign justice in cosmic terms, because earthly justice has not served us well. Human beings are not good at justice. And so I look to the moon, and each day the moon tells me what energies to expect. And then I say my stuff. And some of that stuff is about colonization, but it's always connected to the land and the ocean and the sky, because that's what the moon can see, and what the moon draws on. And the sap in the trees is drawn to the moon. There are so many aspects to being. And so the climate crisis, of course, is an important aspect. But there are also larger issues at play. I'll just leave it at that.
I just want to interject I'm in California, and the Indigenous people have helped bring down 4 dams. Hopefully you've read about that. And now the river is flowing and the salmon are returning. Amazing. That was their work. Years and years of trying to get these 4 dams down. And also they've helped bring back controlled burning. And that was a practice before the U.S. Forest Service, took over the control of the land, but it's an old Indigenous practice that worked. And so now the state is recognizing it, at least in California. So just dovetailing, Robert, on all the knowledge that the Indigenous culture has, and it's had for eons.
Good, Nina. Yeah, I read about one of the dams, so it's wonderful to learn more. So thank you.
Yeah, a 4 coming down. Yeah.
I'll just jump in and say that for me, like climate change as an issue is actually just one aspect of other systemic problems. So like, I feel like I might actually have like coined a term for the way I think of my own writing. So like Don DeLillo wrote what are called systems novels, and lots of other people. And I feel like I try to write something that's like essentially systems poetry. So poetry that grapples with like the entire chain of causation of like why the hell and how things are happening in society. And like ultimately, when you think about things that way, you realize that climate change is a choice. Like it's a choice that's being made every day by people with way more power than anyone on this Zoom. And it has almost risen to the level of like people think of it as like as inevitable as the moon coming up or something, but it isn't. Like it is actually something that is like kept in place through power and hegemony and the desire to, dominate lands and hoard resources. And so, yeah, and it's obviously hard to say all this in literature. You have to try, I think. But yeah, if there's anything that I feel like I try to do that I think is like my particular take on climate, it's that like just reminding readers that like, man, this is like something that can be stopped. And like while all the work of like witnessing and mourning is very important, like there is something to be said for like solidarity and strategies and offering something positive. And it's really hard to do that. And I definitely see in writing and other art forms, like there is a kind of fatalism that creeps in, and like it can get people down. And actually, like if you do remember that, like there is a certain amount of agency, hopefully, that we have or can regain. I don't know. It's nice to at least tell myself that I have a positive vision, even if actually the poems I write are actually quite sort of sad and self-pitying.
Well, and actually, that's so interesting, Eric, and because it's that point, I think, where we all, exist, which is between the activism and the creativity. On the one hand, there's commentary, and the commentary has to happen. We have to be engaged with what's going on in our world, whether it's political, economic, social injustices, climate change. So we're actively paying attention and engaging it, maybe writing about it or painting it, whatever our art form is. And that's kind of a commentary level. We have to talk about it with each other and in dialogue with our own work. But then there's that activism also, that not just commentary, but we have to do things, because the change only comes from, I think about the narrative arc of a story. And I teach a lot of creative writing that, story is change. Change is story. Without change, there is no story. So we're not just going to write statically about what is going on. We're writing for change. And I really love that point that it is so easy. We're all in despair, of course. But it's also really important to note the way a conversation like this is even a form of, looking for change, listening to each other, and then going and reading each other's work and teaching it. I love that Robert said he would, be curious about teaching Nina's work. It's just fantastic, because this is the way we keep learning and sharing that knowledge, but also looking for the change.
That reminds me of the quote I hear often, as on book tour, just conversation is the fertile field for change. So if people aren't talking about it or thinking about it, nothing's going to change. There's so many ways to distract yourself today. So a million ways. So to get the focus on this issue, first of all, and back to Eric's point, that, we have the technology right now to address a lot of this. We do. Alternative energy. I work for a group called the Climate Center up in Santa Rosa, California. And alternative energy, even if we shifted 30% over, the fossil fuel consumption and burning would drop dramatically. So it is a choice, but not to underestimate the power that is resisting that choice and that huge amount of money. And then you bring up Michelle, just to interject, I think writing about climate change, there's a careful and delicate balancing act between hope and being truthful.
Yeah.
Because the truth with all, the devastation going on and these different, bars that we keep surpassing, the lines that we keep surpassing, if it's just despair, it leads to apathy or nothing. So I feel like I keep my pulse on, like, okay, has there been joy in this story? Has there been beauty, natural beauty in this story, along with the despair and the destruction? So that, life is ambiguous. It's full of the and, right? Include all of it. So that to me, and if you get writing in this field, that's a really important balancing act.
Yes, if I could just pick up on that point, which I find fascinating, because so much writing goes from the apocalyptic to the dystopian. There's Whereas I attended a workshop in the UK where their writing looked at adaptation as a way, sometimes you can't bring joy into it, but you can give a way of still existing and surviving in it with the look at adaptation. Because picking up on Robert's point and Eric's, it's this, we're basically right now in a war that is unacknowledged, and that is a global war for resources. This somehow slips under the net, and yet to deal with it, we kind of really have to get rid of the notion of the sovereign state. Yeah. Something to unify humanity. But in saying that, I'm conscious of sounding hopelessly idealistic. So maybe at least an adaptation that's a concrete thing, a concrete story you can tell that will give people a means to want to be active about this.
Thanks, Linda. I'm conscious Susan wants to speak, so I'll let go for it, Susan.
No, it's okay. After you, Robert.
Well, that idea of a war of resources, we can be transformative at the local level, like our local papu at Pukitelaki Marae, which is just north of Dunedin. We're doing things like gathering underia because there were ships that brought that seaweed in to our coastline. And then, so there's some wonderful work by our iwi, our tribe, and trying to convert that into something that can be sold back to the source of the underia as medicine. There are all sorts of things that we can do that don't necessarily have to be overtly political. And I'm talking about Indigenous well-being here because so many of our leaders are under the gun, some literally. I'm talking globally now. I've had experiences where I've seen up close the kinds of stresses placed on our leaders, and it's not fair. And we all need to be powerful people. We all need to be strong, but we also need to be realistic. And sometimes we have to be local and do what we can, and still be hooked up to that idea of well-being. There was a wonderful philosopher, there is a wonderful philosopher, Sir Mason Jury, who talks about the ecological synergy spiral. And I love that kind of synergistic thinking that we can draw on so many aspects of being alive and making sure that we're alive too. So kia ora. Sorry, Susan.
No, that's wonderful, Robert. And there's so much richness in what you're all saying. I think what stands out to me is all these kind of tensions that we're amidst about both what's happening and how to respond to it. There's a lot of paradoxes there about the big and the small and the agencies we have and the limitations on those agencies. And I think I love that you were picking up as well on change being a question, a lot of our emotional orientation to these subjects of where we find hope and joy and anxiety. And part of my academic research is about climate emotion and climate doomers or climate grief, but also that's been very part of my personal experience. And I liked what you were saying also, Nina, about not being, we're seeking change, but not being didactic in the way we're speaking to people about it. And so for me, I've kind of gone in my writing back to just being very honest and very raw about how I've sat with those tensions and paradoxes and where I've felt and lived the change in myself, or where I've found the hope, even if it's the silliest, smallest thing of I touched some moss today and it brought me comfort without that ever having to negate the things that weren't okay about that day or about the wider context. And I loved as well, I think you were bringing it up before, Robert, the entangledness of all these things. For me, it's so much the and. And so to look back to Rachel's fantastic question, starting off this bit of the conversation about, is it in the front or the back of what we're doing? I think it's so much of it in my writing is the and. If I'm writing about climate crisis, it's never just about that. It's climate crisis and settlerhood, or climate crisis and motherhood, or and beekeeping, and whether I go in from the climate crisis and then it has to connect to something else specific, or I go in from something else and I'm accidentally writing about climate again. I think revealing those entanglements is hopefully not muddying the waters. It's actually just placing it in a lived context that is, it's not isolated from any other part of our experience or our politics, as you've all been saying so beautifully.
Thank you, Susan. I think you're so right. It is just all, I mean, it is our life. And so there's no way that we can separate one from the other. It does become part of everything. So I'm just thinking about our intentions when we're writing these stories. I guess if we look to our big hopes, whether we're telling these small local stories or if we're looking at like wider systemic change, what are the hopes for the power of our words and raising up words of communities who we don't hear the stories from so often, but are probably are being impacted the most, or will be the most.
Yeah, that's true. I wanted to throw out there, I teach a class for Stanford called Alternative Plot Theory, or Plotting Outside the Box. And I highly recommend, if there's writers listening to this, Ursula Le Guin's Carrier Bag Theory of Fiction. You're nodding, some of you are. So that's how I open the course, that it's time for new stories and different structures of stories that don't have the singular hero's journey of conquering something. Essentially, hunt and kill story, which, the Western literature is all about that, the hero's journey. So I really try to teach other forms. And what I'm hearing also here is the need for more communal stories. There can be conflict in coming up with ways of addressing the problem within the community. How do we go about it? And the discussions that have to happen. So just thinking more of, I teach like more collective plots or other ways to think about not just conquering, everything.
Kia ora, that's fantastic, Nina. Yeah, I want to look up that Ursula Le Guin carry your bag theory. I love it.
Your bag, yeah, it's from 1986. Yeah, I think it's 86. The Carrier Bag Theory of Fiction. And she writes it, as a parable, but the message is pretty clear. And it also, Susan, addresses entanglement, because there's a clear gender agenda in the piece itself, that it's usually the man that went out hunting and the man had the story and the females were gathering nuts and berries, and there wasn't very much, climactic about that, right? Like that story, or, nursing little baby. So anyway, there's a gender element, and climate is entangled with so many aspects of life.
Which isn't even true. Like, hunter-gatherer societies didn't operate that way. In some ways, that's a literary fiction about the total gender division, which is actually infuriating when you think about it.
Yeah, how minimized women are in the story. I know I highly recommend also, I know you're coming to this question, The Great Derangement. Amitav Ghosh, Climate Change and the Unthinkable. Just an amazing work. And he points out that literature around the time of the Industrial Revolution, a separation happened between humans and the non-human world. And so-called literature, the high-class literature, he says the fiction that's in the castle essentially banished the non-human. And it happened right about the Industrial Revolution. So paradoxically or ironically, we started just paying attention to humans and nothing else in at least the Western literature.
And I think for me, I just building on what you're saying, Nina, the idea of news stories. One thing I've carried through between my academic field and my writing is the idea of defamiliarization. That it's, when we can see something that we're so close to, that's so familiar, in a new way, whether that's through a new plot structure or a new way in. And as you say, beyond the human as well, which can include, you were saying you wrote into nature as a perspective, and I've written into sort of more than human or non-human creatures on occasion, which feels risky but full of potential. I think that is what we need in this era of these, giant issues, is to take things that are in some ways too close to us, the natural and living world that we live with, and see them differently, hold them as magical and important and sacred, or just in some other way, turn them on their head and feel differently towards them, think differently towards them, and hopefully in doing that on a small scale, be able to feel and think differently about the whole.
Yeah, I mean, it reminds me of Richard Powers' Overstory, and all of a sudden people are talking about trees. Like one book, one novel, like everyone's like, I had no idea, and like I love trees. And then it makes me think of I don't know if you remember the record, The Sound of the Humpback Whale, or the song, they called it Songs of the Humpback Whale in the 70s. And it was two scientists that recorded songs of the humpback whale, and they intentionally used the word song to anthropomorphize the whale so that people would care. And that led to international laws banning whaling. So if you can build some bridge to the non-human, and it seems to be that humans are a species that need to see human in the other to care, then to me, subjectification and anthropomorphizing is on the table now. To me, it's a tool we can use.
Yeah, I've just finished a book called The Light Eaters, and it's it's about enhanced plant consciousness and our understanding of that. And there are so many abilities of plants that I wasn't really aware of. That just the idea that they even have lenses that they can actually, process light. So they've got a form of vision, which is astounding. They've got touch, and they seem to be behaving like they're conscious. And scientists don't quite understand where the brain is.
Yeah,
That's
But,
amazing.
yeah, but it does tap into poetics. I mean, the kinds of poetics that are cosmic. I love a book by Jill Pearce called The Mystic Spiral, and it goes across world cultures looking at images of spiral thinking. And just the imagery, it's quite a simple book to look at. Even if you just look at it, you're looking at Sufi mysticism, you're looking at Celtic runes, you're looking at Māori whakairo. And all of these spiral kind of images speak to a greater consciousness, and plants are tapping it. It's wild, but that's where plants are. They're wild, and so are the creatures. Wild, not domestic. We're not domestic.
yeah.
I love that idea of how, I mean, all of this relates to everything that we're saying about what a lot of you have been saying about telling the stories new, thinking about our world in new ways, because that's where the creativity happens, but it's also where the conversation is propelled forward, I think. And this makes me think, I have my daughter is doing composition work up in Auckland, and her whole focus is around music and listening to the natural world and transforming it into orchestral or other kinds of work that we then as human beings can we can take in, we can understand. I mean, there's so many sounds in nature that we just don't hear, we can't comprehend. And her specific project this year with her graduate work is around the sounds that coral reefs make. And most of you in the room will know this. We sailed for 20 years, and she grew up on a sailboat. So her entire life was spent in the ocean. And we saw firsthand, the degrading, we saw beautiful, active, live coral reefs, and we saw the degradation of them in different places around the world in all the oceans. And so we've very much been immersed in that life. And it's incredible to see that she's found this way that her passion, which is music, she's listening, she's found these ways, and she's working with scientists and listening to there are very specific sounds that active, healthy coral reefs make, and then the ones that are dying, they make different sounds, and it's in the waves, the sound waves that are all around us. And I just love that we can. I'm talking about my daughter, but there are so many people doing incredible things across the arts, across the sciences, all of that feeding each other. And I think that key thing is that listening element, whether you're then turning it into a story, listening to humpback whales in the 70s, listening to coral reefs, listening to trees and plants, these plants that are operating at levels that are almost beyond our comprehension. But it's so exciting to know that this world is so much bigger than we are. And that's the thing that I think is exciting.
I completely agree. I highly recommend a book called The Sounds of Life by Karen Bakker. It's Bakker. They're using AI and small recorders looking for patterns so that small digital recorders will pick up sounds that the human ear cannot hear. It reminds me because they recorded coral and then put it into AI, which can pick up pattern and then correlate to the visual responses. And they are finding, for example, the coral, but also bats are talking. Bats have names for each other. And they're using, it seems like a really, AI is used in a lot of bad ways, but now this is a really interesting scientific way to use it, that they're decoding bats, they're decoding the language of bats, decoding the language of bees even. The bees talk to each other and say, fly over here, or there's a threat over there. And again, we can't hear it. We thought they were stupid, right? Because we, human exceptionalism, we think we can't hear it. They're stupid. It's like, but we just aren't designed to hear them. So this whole other, to me, we're so lost. And Robert, I'm so envious of you that you've been so connected to the land. To me, it's all talking. It's all talking. And we've turned to, because I've also explored a lot of artificial intelligence because it's going on in the Bay Area, and people are turning to these, chat companions. They're not human, right? And this is a rising phenomena of people going to the non-human chat machine for a relationship when all of nature is speaking. And if you just stepped outside, if you just went to the ocean, I don't know. I mean, I'm completely biased because obviously, but it just seems like we're so lost here.
Yeah, and we're a little bit arrogant as a species. I mean, like plants have been here, like, what, about 1 billion years? And how long have we been around, Gosh. and the plants were here before the animals. That's the thing. And so the plants set it all up. The very air that we're breathing is plant-based. We're really lucky because of plants. That's why we're here. So, while the bees are running around, it was probably plant pheromones that sent them on their journeys, And there's lots of stuff we just don't know. But that's why I write like that. I write the stuff I don't know, because I know I can't know everything. And there's a freedom in that. And that's why I turn to the moon, because it's a form of letting go too. And it actually helps with things like anxiety, the terrible worry that we've got about the climate crisis, etc., etc. There's just things in our universe that we can turn to still, even if it's the moon.
Yeah,
that's really beautiful, Robert. Thank you. I see we're coming close to the end of time. And Nina made some great recommendations about some books. Are there any other titles of some wonderful, I guess, it doesn't have to be climate writing, connection to our natural world writing that people would like to recommend?
I've just got one other, In the Garden Against Time by Olivia Lang. She talks about this wonderful nature poet, John Clare, who I wasn't very familiar with, but just the journey. I mean, gardens, of course, are domesticated wilderness spaces, I guess you could say. But the cultural history that she takes us on is tremendous. And of course, I always talk about our traditional Māori poetry. So if you're fortunate to speak Te Reo Māori, always turn to our mōtiatia, because that's what drives the poetics, the natural world.
John Clare is very much in my wheelhouse because one of the things that he's sort of famous for is writing about enclosure. So the aftermaths of enclosure. So the sort of, well, theft of common lands, grazing lands in England. Again, sort of pointing to the fact that like things that happen to ordinary people are often because of money that other people need to make. Yeah, I guess also because we were sort of asked to think about people whose work we would recommend, and it's like it's actually really impossible to mention one person, of course. But I feel like honestly, like year after year, and this isn't literature, but like George Monbiot honestly just like is like a clarion voice in like mainstream media for like just not letting people forget that like this is it's not only climate, it's obviously environmental things and the intersection of that with other things. And I'd shout out some books that I've liked recently. So I mean, from here, Joan Fleming's Song of Less is a really good verse novel about a dystopian sort of aftermath of sort of hideous climate change. Mama Amazonica by Pascal Petit is really good. That's poetry. The Trees Witness Everything by Victoria Chang. Yeah, I'll throw it over to some other people.
If you could put it in the chat, that would be great.
I'm doing it on my phone, so it's hard to type like that,
Oh,
but
okay,
I'll try.
sorry. Okay.
Does anyone else? Oh, you go, Susan.
Yeah, since we were talking about listening, Michelle's very humbly not mentioned her own book, but The Everrumble is a beautiful book which deals very closely with listening, with the main character who can listen beyond normal human hearing. And I think it must be fascinating, Michelle, to see that in your work and then in your daughter's work with a kind of theme that carries through around sound. So wholeheartedly can recommend The Everrumble to anyone. Within New Zealand, I think Nadine Ann Hura's writing is a really beautiful Indigenous perspective on climate change and moving between poetry and essays and more journalistic pieces. I really think she's an incredible writer. And one that surprised me most joyfully, even though it's quite heavy recently, is a children's author, Bren McDibble, who's a New Zealand author, but writing in and from Australia quite often, middle grade fiction, including The Apprentice Witnesser, Across the Risen Sea, often dealing with these kind of dystopian post-climate crisis visions of a future from a child's lens. Quite heavy topics, but also very fresh and very hopeful in their own way. And I think I'm a bit biased, but children's writing can often hold really, really strong and fresh perspectives on these things. And so that is one that's done well, Bren McDibble.
Yes, that's wonderful. I just want to recommend Noreen Masood's A Flat Place, writing about complex childhood trauma and the healing power of nature. Many other poets, and you mentioned Pascal Petit, Eric. Just want to just highlight how Pascal takes her mother's just mental disintegration and makes a joy of it. To use that word, Nina, of yours, makes joy by imagining her mother as a jaguar in the Amazon. So the power of words to explain situations or make us heal. Yeah.
Well, I'll just mention because Susan was talking about youth writing and fiction that's for young people, but also I'll just do a plug here since this is the National Flash Fiction Day oriented weekend. We have youth writing in National Flash Fiction Day as well, and it's always interesting to see that whatever youth are writing about, they are writing about what's going on in our world, whether it's politics or government or economics or family crisis, mental health, and climate change is always right in the middle of their writing. And there's some incredibly powerful, beautiful, and really delicate writing that comes out of young writers. And so that's really exciting to see. And the other thing is, let's see, I'm thinking about a couple other people just locally in New Zealand. I think Vana Manasiadis writes really beautifully poetic work that's addressing the crises of the day. And Lynn Jenner is often, I think, maybe an underrated writer in New Zealand.
Oh.
We all should be reading more of Lynn Jenner. She wrote an incredible book called Pete, which was published a few years ago by Otago University Press. And it was simultaneously about the expressway that was being built along the Kapiti coast where she was living, and Charles Brosh. And she is somebody who manages to weave together very unlikely topics. So poetics and history and this activity that is happening, this monstrous activity that's changing landscapes. So I think people who can write like that about many things at once, who are so ambidextrous, are really wonderful to look at and pay attention to.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Michelle. And I'm going to try and compile all of those, and I will put them in the YouTube channel chat so that we can all go back to them. I'd just like to thank you, Ngā mihi nui, to all of you so much. It's been a really enriching conversation, and I feel full of hope from hearing all our collective voices. So thank you all so much. Have a wonderful rest of your day, and please everyone join in for our the rest of our Festival of Flash, which will be coming tomorrow, starting early tomorrow morning. Wonderful. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Rachel. Thank you, everybody.
Kia ora. Thank you, everyone. It's wonderful.
Kia ora.
Thanks, everyone.